Hey, everybody, Will here.
Hi, I'm Brad.
We are doing something a little bit different this week. I'm on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
You're also on vacation?
No.
Or you're about to be on vacation?
Or actually, yeah, the following week, yes. There's like a day of overlap there, sure.
Yeah, you're off now. Congratulations.
Yeah, that's right. No, thank you.
We are, instead of running a new tech pod this week, we have a FOSS Pod episode that we, look, if you asked me to pick my favorite FOSS Pod episode, it would be impossible for me to do so because they're all like children and I love them all equally.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a fantastic episode of the FOSS Pod this week.
Yes.
We have Eben Upton from the Raspberry Pi Foundation and Raspberry Pi on to talk about making these little computers that have literally changed my life. Like yes. I don't think we'd be doing this show were it not like the Raspberry Pi is one of the things that opened the door to doing this show for me.
I think I said it in somewhere in this episode. I think it was pretty much my gateway into Linux. It was the first time I ever used Linux. Was the first time I got a Pi. Anyway, yeah. So this is an excellent, if I do say so myself, an excellent conversation. He's super fascinating to talk to. Also, this is a never before heard episode. This is brand new in both the FOSS Pod feed and also going on the Tech Pod feed here. So even if you're an avid FOSS Pod listener, you have not heard this one yet.
Yeah, it's fresh.
That's right.
Enjoy. And have a piece of pie with your Raspberry Pi episode. Brad, how many computers did you have in your house in 2010?
Let's see. A gaming desktop and a laptop. And I think that's it. How about you?
That was probably me too. I might have had a server. I think I probably had a server by then, but it was like a really low powered, even for the time, Atom processor, home server type deal that was basically just like an SMB share.
Sure.
I didn't have anything beyond that. I had a router, which I guess you could argue is kind of a computer, but not much else.
It was probably running Linux of some sort, although you may not have known that. But yeah, like even two computers at that time felt a little bit extravagant, but boy, little did we know what was on the way.
Yeah. How many computers do you have running in your house right now in 2023, Brad?
Gosh. Well, okay. I've still got a desktop. I've still got a laptop. Now I've got this big Linux box over here, but also at least 4 Raspberry Pis around here, maybe more. And if you want to get into, do containers running on the Raspberry Pis count as computers? Because then we're up to like 24.
Yeah, I'm in a similar, like I have the desktop, the streaming machine, the NAS, my kid's computer, my wife's computer, and then about 2 or 3 Raspberry Pis at any given time.
They just keep multiplying. The Raspberry Pi has become so indispensable. I have thought about adopting a policy of just having an extra on hand at all times. I mean, not super feasible right now because they're hard to come by for supply chain reasons, which you will hear about shortly. But sometimes a project urge just strikes and you need a Raspberry Pi. It might be nice to just be able to reach into the drawer and grab one.
Well, I just set up a Home Assistant Yellow, which is a Raspberry Pi compute module based project that freed up one of my old Pi 3s. And I was really excited because like I would have more Pis in the house right now, except for you have not been able to buy them for the last 2 years reliably. So
that's the thing about the Pi, though, it's always useful.
You can never have too much Pi. That's what I say. Welcome to the FOSS Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
As always, this week's episode of the FOSS Pod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. You can find out more at opensource.google. This week on the FOSS Pod, we're talking to Eben Upton, co-founder and CEO of Raspberry Pi Trading Company, and he's just a fascinating guy, it turns out.
And the Raspberry Pi Foundation. That was something I learned in the course of this interview, was the distinction between those two. But dude, Raspberry Pi, it's like perhaps as big an institution in the maker world, the open source world, the
manufacturing.
Yes. The range of contexts in which these adorable little fruit flavored single board computers are used is kind of endless these days.
Yeah, it's funny because we were talking about this before we started the show. I can't really think of a project that, in the normie, non-techie world, people are pretty much completely unaware of. Mm-hmm. But like in our circles, everybody knows about this, and it became such a ubiquitous, important part of the computing ecosystem in like less than a decade, really. Because like the first Pi boards launched in 2012, and there honestly wasn't a whole lot you could do with them if you couldn't write code in those early days. And then projects started building, like the fact that this single board computer existed that was $20 or $30 meant that projects would start tailoring their kind of single service computer projects specifically for them. And whether it was like an arcade machine emulator or an old console emulator or a router or a DNS server that strips out all advertising from the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Print servers, 3D print servers or interfaces, Home Assistant, you name it.
Yeah. Network VNC machines.
Smart mirrors.
Wait, smart mirrors? I haven't seen that one.
Dude, if you never... there are a lot of smart mirror projects involving Raspberry Pis out there. They look so cool.
Oh, man, I just put a new medicine cabinet in. I should do a smart mirror in there.
You should slap a Raspberry Pi and the guts of an old monitor on the back of that mirror. Yeah, the Pi is such a formative kind of gateway into open source for me. Like, I'm pretty sure the first Model B I bought was the first, like, real experience I had with Linux, honestly. Because like you said, those early projects, I mean, I wasn't writing code, but those early projects that were available for the Pi, you kind of couldn't set up without at least touching a bash prompt, right? And I don't think I had done a lot of that prior to getting my first Pi. So, you know, a big deal for, I think, a lot of people's first steps into the world of Linux and open source.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, the Raspberry Pi is a single board computer. It runs ARM processors. There's 4 main models and a bunch of little submodels now, maybe 5 main models. I think the Zero probably counts as its own thing at this point.
Yeah.
And you can use them for all sorts of things. There's 2 things that make them different. We talk about it a little bit in the episode. But one is that they're, pandemic concerns aside, typically always available. So they're not batch products. They're products that they just continuously manufacture. You can go to your local electronics store and get one.
They still make the original. That's been out for over a decade. They are committed to making that thing for several more years.
The other thing is what used to be called Raspbian and is now called Raspberry Pi OS is a fork of Debian that's basically designed explicitly to run on these boards. And there's an installer that you can download for it that runs on Windows and lets you put the right OS files on a flash drive or a USB thumb drive or whatever, whatever it is you happen to need, that lets you basically jump straight into the appliance mode for the Linux setup for these devices. You don't necessarily have to start from first you install Debian and then you apt-get install your whatever project it is you want, and then you have to do all the configuration stuff. It just works.
Yes. That's really what it is. I think this thing has reached a critical mass. Like, it's picked up that level of community support that you don't have to be a Linux graybeard. Like, there's just endless tutorials and tools and guides and all kinds of stuff out there to ease you into this.
To the point that often the projects say, hey, the easiest way to set this up is to just buy a Raspberry Pi, install it on the Raspberry Pi. Don't try to run it in a container on a normal Linux installer or whatever.
Yes, unless you're a loon.
Yeah.
It's often as simple as, here's our image, here's how to flash it to an SD card, just put it in there, press the power button, you're good.
I think that's all you need to know about this interview. Let's just get into it with the first time I heard about a Raspberry Pi in person. Eben, I went to a lot of maker fairs in the early 2010s, and the best part of that was always getting to interview people who'd made fascinating stuff. But I usually close those interviews by asking people what they were excited about at the maker fair. And in 2012 or 2013, I remember I went to one maker fair and 5 or 6 people within the first half day said, oh, there's this little computer the size of an Arduino. You got to check it out. It's really cool. And I'm curious, like, that was the moment I was like, oh, I should be aware of this thing. I got to learn about this. I'm curious if there was a moment for you when you realized the Pi was something that like really filled a need, like this personal need that maybe first nerds and then just normal people, it turns out, had.
Yes, we had. I mean, obviously, this isn't something that we'd ever imagined was going to sell a lot of units. It's a thing we were building to encourage kids to come to Cambridge. And so our idea of success was, our idea of success was 1,000 units, and our idea of wild success was 10,000 units. I think the point where I realized that we were in trouble was in the autumn of 2011. So we'd been working on it since 2008. And we'd sort of told people in May of 2011 that we were doing it. And we'd done this by going to see a guy called Rory Ketherland-Jones, who's a BBC technology correspondent, and he took a little video of one of us holding up a very early Raspberry Pi prototype and talking about what we were trying to accomplish. And he got this vast number of YouTube views for his video. He got 600,000 YouTube views in a couple of days, which was kind of cool. But it's very easy to want to apply a very large discount factor to that number to measure interest. So we thought we were fine, and then we spent a lot of time in 2011 getting from the sort of point. It was the kick that we needed. It was the kick in the pants that we needed to actually go from noodling away at this thing to actually trying to turn it into a real project. So we were spending 2011 going through that process of productionizing Raspberry Pi, but we didn't imagine that we had 600,000 people who were interested enough to buy a Raspberry Pi. But the point where we realized that we were in trouble and that we're going to sell a lot of these and that we would have to scale the organization to support that was when we put an operating system image online in about November of 2011. And it got something like, and this was I think that this was a Fedora-based operating system, and it had something like 50,000, and you could only run it in QEMU, right? There was no hardware out there, so you could run it in a modified QEMU. We had 50,000 downloads of a very badly broken operating system for a computer that didn't exist yet. And that was the bit where we realized that this had tapped into, it had found in that kind of big parameter space of the things people are interested in. We'd accidentally dropped a product into a completely empty space where a lot of people were standing. It was empty of products, but very full of people. Yeah, that's probably then.
The idea that you could get a whole, I mean, so in those early days, it was novel to have a Linux ARM machine, right? Like finding compiled binaries and stuff for Linux software. It wasn't difficult's not right, but it was unusual, I think, still then. And like there was an inflection point around the time the second Raspberry Pi came out that seemed to stop, that all of a sudden everybody had Pi compatible binaries for everything in all their repos.
Yeah, I think it was certainly when we started, I guess probably 2009, 2010, when we were first working on what would become the Raspberry Pi platform. ARM Linux itself, the kernel was an unusual thing, right? I can't remember, because it existed for a long time outside the tree. I guess it had maybe been merged by then, but ARM Linux was outside the tree for a long time. It had probably been merged, but probably fairly recently. There were various distros available, but it was all a bit. Everything was a bit special, and how you built things. I remember, trying to find a compiler. Trying to find a pre-built GCC to bootstrap yourself and to build your kernel wasn't trivial. And yeah, there's just kind of a moment, if you draw that line between, I guess, that point, the kind of 2010, and probably you could say maybe the launch of the M1 Max was probably the point where ARM as a client architecture kind of emerges completely into the mainstream. There is that point somewhere in the middle there where large numbers of applications were starting to provide binaries, generally Raspberry Pi binaries, generally binaries for this slightly unusual, the Raspbian world. Right, so that's ARM 7HF, so hard float ARM Debian, but built to remove the V7 specific instructions so it could run on the ARM 1176 that we had in Raspberry Pi 1. Those sorts of things started to appear in kind of 2013, 2014, 2015.
I'm gonna ask you to suspend your humility for just a second here. Would you say the Pi was the first kind of primary driver of ARM adoption in Linux, or were there other solutions out there concurrently?
I mean, of course, Beagle. I would say Beagle. The Beagle board predates us, probably the first broadly available. I guess it didn't have the continuous. One of the interesting things about Raspberry Pi, and of course, we've been challenged with this over the last couple of years, but for most of its life, one of the interesting things that's characterized Raspberry Pi is its kind of continuous high volume availability. And that was probably a thing that the Beagle board didn't have. It was something which was sporadically available. They would build some and then sell them out and then build some more. But it did, and it was probably 3 or 4 times the price, 4 or 5 times the price of Raspberry Pi, but it did fit that same niche. But yeah, certainly I think we popularized it as a platform. Sort of going on to that point about the M1 machines, of course, we were super happy. We have this object called Raspberry Pi 400, right, which is a Raspberry Pi 4 built into a compact keyboard. We launched that about a week before the M1 Max. Now, I grew up with not owning but lusting after Acorn Archimedes, the original ARM computer, the original ARM desktop, and it was kind of fun that we actually were first back in market by a week. We were after a 20-year period in the wilderness where there were no kind of consumer-oriented ARM PCs, we buy a week, were first back in market.
Very basic chicken and egg question here, because the Raspberry Pi's foundation, like the original mission statement, is educational outreach, right? So Was it a situation of we need to do educational outreach and then through brainstorming you came to, hey, we can make a tiny, very affordable computer? Or was it the opposite of, hey, we can make this tiny computer because the parts and the software are now emerging, and then what can we do with it?
It's interesting, right? And it's all about how you tell stories, right? Which bit you want to emphasize. I think for me, it was a coming together of those. It was a perfect coming together of those two strands, and there wasn't really a chicken and egg. That I was building little computers, actually quite Arduino-like little computers. So there's this thing that if you search for Raspberry Pi 2006 edition, there's this rather cobbled together looking piece of Veriboard that has an Atmel, so the same chip architecture as the Arduino Uno. It's an Atmel 644. It's got 512k of SRAM, and it will drive a standard definition video signal, and it bashes, actually uses a microcontroller both to run your code, but also during the display period to bash out video addresses to get this SRAM to drop bytes onto the bus in the order required to draw something on the screen. So I was building those things, and I was also a director of studies in computer science at the University of Cambridge, and so I was also experiencing the collapse in the number of young people who are interested in computer science, and we saw this terrible decline between the late 1990s and the mid part of the first decade of this century. And so I was kind of exposed to both things. So it was a sort of a natural coming together. And really, remember, Raspberry Pi is testing the hypothesis that we used to have loads of kids who were interested in computers because there were loads of programmable computers in kids' lives, and that when you took those computers away, because you largely replaced them with games consoles in a lot of children's lives, the ultimate piece of very powerful non-programmable hardware, end-user programmable hardware. The disappearance of general-purpose computing made the kids go away, and if you bring back general-purpose computing, the kids will come back. That's the hypothesis we're testing, and it was a kind of hypothesis that was very easy to stumble upon if you happen to be both building little computers and confronting the disappearance of computing among young people. So there's not really it's a kind of a perfect coming together of these two strands of certainly of my life.
It's funny because it's an idea that has shown up multiple times. Growing up in America, we didn't have the rise of programmable computers as much. They were much less available, I think, here than they were in the UK specifically. And it's a thing that comes up a lot when I talk to programmers of a certain age, I think, from the UK specifically.
The UK is weird, and it certainly is a place. If you look at the number of 8-bit computers, I mean, of course, the United States, you had your Commodore 64s, and you had your Trash 80s, and you had a bunch of other architectures, and your Apple IIs. But if you look at the number of distinct 8-bit microcomputer architectures that came out of a country that has a fifth of the population of the United States. It's just incredible, right? You look at the number of architectures that came out of Cambridge, that were developed within five miles of where I'm sitting. It's just, there was something about the place that made it a very fertile ground. And of course, many of those companies sold 10,000 units. The two big ones, of course, were Sinclair, who sold about 5 million of their Spectrum product, mostly in the UK, but did have some export success. And then, of course, Acorn, who sold about 1.5 million BBC microcomputers, failed as a computer company, but then succeeded in terms of spinning off this little chip design organization that became ARM.
Talking about the decline in kind of interest in computing among young people that you mentioned. I mean, there's this emerging theme in the tech press, even these days, that basically says like, oh, kids don't know what a file system is anymore. Like they only know how to type on touchscreens now. Like, do you still think that's true? Or, I mean, has your foundation made enough inroads? Are you seeing those tides turn through your efforts or otherwise?
I think if you imagine there's this scalar value that we care about, which is number of applicants to the University of Cambridge, the deadline is the 15th of October, something like that. So on the 16th of October every year, you're presented with a scalar number. That value went from about 600 in 1999 to about 200 to 250 in 2008. And last year, that scalar was about 1,450. So we have a little over twice as many applicants to computer science at the University of Cambridge as we had at the height of the dot-com boom when everyone thought that computer science was a meal ticket, right? So if you just look at that number, yes, there has been an absolute sea change over the last 10 or 12 years. And I think Raspberry Pi has had a part in that. I think that the kids who rock up at least have the good sense to pretend that Raspberry Pi was the reason for this. Fascinating thing for me as somebody who grew up writing computer games on my BBC Micro and then on my Commodore Amiga and had imagined that the primary use case for Raspberry Pi in education would be software, the vast majority of these people say Raspberry Pi and robotics. So the vast majority of these people are not having a purely software-mediated interaction with Raspberry Pi. It's about physical computing, which means it's very, very lucky. I mean, that's obviously somewhere Raspberry Pi kind of stands out. It's not something that I was super excited. Those general-purpose I/O pins on a Raspberry Pi, which allow you to do all those kind of cool general-purpose those cool physical computing things. That was Pete Lomas, who designed the first generation Raspberry Pi hardware, was very keen to expose some of the interfacing capabilities of the chip we were using, and I didn't care enough to argue with him. And of course, how lucky we were both, of course, in the education space, but also that was the capability that unlocked the industrial use of Raspberry Pi, which really now accounts for the majority of our sales.
I was going to say the politics of ports on these kinds of little dev boards is really interesting because you have the entire spectrum now, right? You have a development board that has a bunch of USB and HDMI and audio outs and all the things you need to make it basically a little tiny either single serving server or a single serving desktop or laptop or whatever you want. But then you also have the compute modules which let you just drop an SoC on a board that somebody else designs and plug into whatever ins and outs that they're looking for. And I'm curious how you think about that going now and how it's changed and what you're thinking about going forward.
The nice thing with the core platform, so the SBC, the single board computer platform, that's a kind of classic Raspberry Pi, it's still the dominant volume runner for us out of, 7. Obviously, last year was a rather volume constrained year, but if you look back to 2021 when we sold 7 million Raspberry Pi computers of all sorts, the SBC product, the single board computer product, with its 4 USB ports, an Ethernet connector, that was between 5.5 and 6 million units. And so compute module was on the order of a million units. So the SBC is the volume runner. We're lucky that we've never had to really make any decisions to prioritize, say, educational users of that product or industrial users of that product. The decisions you make to make it a great educational product are also make it a great industrial product, because particularly the kind of robustness, the reliability and robustness, they're very important. We always say, what's the worst environment? What's the more challenging environment? An oil rig or a kid's bedroom? They're both pretty. I mean, I've got 2 kids, and I've never been on an oil rig, but I've been to some power stations. A kid's bedroom is a pretty tough environment. So we've kind of always been able to kind of like have a happy medium, you never have to choose one consumer over the other. We have now compute module, which is purely targeted to the embedded and industrial space. And of course we have Pi 400, which is purely targeted at the consumer space. So we have put our toes in the water in both directions. The nice thing is actually both of those are kind of, most of the investments we make are at the platform level. So deriving those specific platforms from the core platform, from the SBC platform, is actually quite cheap from a cost and an engineering perspective. So we have tried to kind of, we put this product in the market in the middle of the market, and then we just kind of tried to feel out what people don't like. And the main thing that people don't like as they go to scale with the SBC is they don't like being enslaved by our form factor choices, right? And you do see people who, you do see industrial, that I have a keen eye for the appearance of that boat tail, the 2 pairs of USB connectors and the Ethernet jack. And if you look carefully at lots of industrial products, you see that boat tail a lot, right? It's the sign that someone's built a big object, an industrial object, and there's been enough space inside it. And so their solution for how do they embed a Raspberry Pi is they put it inside, they have a wiring loom or a hat that sits on top of it and mounts their circuitry. The challenge that people have is when they try to address more consumer-oriented use cases, they don't want to have to follow our choices about onboard peripherals. They won't have to follow our choices about connector layout. And that's really where the compute module products, they've been kind of a slow burn. We've actually been doing compute modules since 2014. And it's really only the last couple of years, and I think with the introduction of compute module 4, that started to take off like a rocket. So it's still a small part of our volume, but by far the largest growing segment of our business.
I mean, given the lead time on new board designs and hardware for, especially I think about Home Assistant and folks like that in this space, and like the time it took them to design the board and all that, if as that compute module form factor becomes a little more static or stable, I think it'll help those projects ramp and lean into that kind of stuff faster and better maybe.
Yeah, and we've had two distinct form factors for the compute module. So until up to compute module 3, compute module 3 plus, we have an SODIMM form factor where you put a JEDEC SODIMM socket down on your board and then kind of slide it in and clip it in like a memory module. And then compute module 4, we threw that. And we had continuity of, we had backwards and forwards compatibility in that space. And then compute module 4, we replaced that with a pair of high density managed impedance connectors that you clip down onto the board. And that's definitely been a good choice. It's a more space efficient choice. It's a more cost effective choice. I guess the other decisions I think we made with compute module 4, which were informed by experience with earlier modules and have really helped us. We put Wi-Fi on the board as an option. And there's a platform, I'm not sure if it's defunct now, called Android Things, which is effectively an IoT platform built around the Android kernel and bits of the Android userland. And I had a very revealing conversation with a member of the Google Android Things team in Tokyo, I think back in about 2018. And he said, well, look, you really need to put Wi-Fi on your module, because what it means is as soon as you want to go to scale, you have to really you either have to do a bunch of Wi-Fi engineering yourself, or you kind of have to abandon the Raspberry Pi platform and the compute module platform for another platform. So we put Wi-Fi on as an option. That obviously eases a lot of people's integration. It eases a lot of people's migration from the SBC platform, which has integrated Wi-Fi, into the modular space. So that was one thing. The other thing we did was we massively simplified the power chain. So earlier compute modules, you have to give them a bunch of rails. You have to give them a 3v3 rail and at least a 3v3 and a 1v8 rail, and I think another rail as well. You have to put circuitry on your baseboard that delivers those rails and brings those rails up and takes them down in the proper order, so that nothing latches up. Compute module 4, you give it 5 volts and it makes its own rails. It has a power management IC on there. It makes its own rails. In fact, it gives you the rails back, so it'll give you a 3v3 rail for you to use, as long as you don't draw too much power from it. That's been a huge. I struggle, I think, sometimes when we're speccing and designing these to understand where the pain points are going to be, and so we put these products in the market, and sometimes we find that we've done something that people find painful and it limits the success of a product. That was definitely a big factor in the success of CM4.
So, we're largely an open source podcast here, so I'm curious about open source practices, large and small. I'm curious, is there anywhere in the hardware and software stack that you use open source practices? For example, can anybody contribute to core parts of Raspberry Pi OS, or is it still like a relatively kind of closed or professional effort?
So if you think about the evolution of the Raspberry Pi software environment from 2011, 2012, through to the present day, I think what you're seeing is we have this thing that's occasionally that I call start.elf, and that is sometimes disparagingly called the blob, which is a large closed source software binary that runs on the closed CPUs in the platform. So it runs on the VPU, effectively a DSP. It's actually a fairly powerful DSP, but really these days we only use the Scalar core there as a kind of system management processor. And early days, everything ran on there. Everything multimedia related ran on there. So camera processing, video decode, video encode, display scan out, control of the HDMI subsystem. Did I mention 3D graphics? 3D graphics. So all of that stuff ran inside the blob. And then what you've seen over the years is a kind of carving away of, so where you had an open fairly famously, where you had an OpenGL API on the ARM side, what that was effectively a serialization shim that would take the call, serialize them, pass them over a FIFO down into this blob, which would then do what it was told. And actually, that's kind of great for OpenGL, because OpenGL is designed for that exact, that's a very natural implementation style for OpenGL, but it wasn't very pleasing to people because people couldn't see what was going on inside. And we were very lucky that I think in about 2014, we got permission to release the architecture documentation for the 3D graphics core, the Video Core 4 graphics core in the chip. And we released this, and this is pretty unusual actually, to have good public documentation. I was involved in designing the core, and it's pretty unusual to have good public documentation. That still isn't really the case, certainly say for the Mali cores that you see in a lot of other SoCs. And Emma Anholt joined my team at Broadcom basically to build a Mesa driver stack around this, using this documentation. And so from probably 2014, 2015 onwards, we did have the option to turn off the 3D graphics element of the blob and used Mesa instead. And then Emma went on to develop a driver for Video Core 6, which is the core that we use in the modern Raspberry Pis, and that's then been further improved by Igalia. So on the 3D graphics side, you saw us turning off a bit of the blob, and then in the camera processing side, you saw us turn off the camera processing and move across to lib camera. In display scan out, you saw us turning off that element and moving across to KMS. And so really all that's left actually is video encode. H.264 video encode still runs inside the blob. And that's really, I mean, it's great because obviously we can leverage the efforts of these enormous teams that have put together these very, very powerful middleware systems. We can leverage some of those some of those efforts. We can contribute back to those efforts. If you look at our education mission, it means that there's no point, it's really undesirable for there to be a point where you have to say, here be dragons, don't look inside this black box that does OpenGL. You really want someone who's sufficiently inquisitive to be able to go all the way down and see, when I asked, please draw this triangle, what actually happened deep down at the bottom of the stack, and what do we think is happening inside the hardware. And I suspect that we are, video encode is still there in the blob. I suspect probably in the next but one generation of Raspberry Pi will get down to a point where there's effectively only clocked power and reset. And that's fairly traditional. I mean, Intel chips have the Intel management engine in there. You often have some little, most systems have some little microcontroller which is bringing the big cores out of reset effectively. And we'll probably get to that point. That'll be really desirable, and hopefully we may even get, when we get to that point, even though there will still be a binary and probably a signed binary down there that does those things, hopefully we'll even be able to publish the source for that binary so people can even understand what that's doing.
Speaking of new functionality and adding new functionality to the core and to the CPUs and to the Pis downstream, how does stuff like machine learning acceleration and the kind of the stuff that happens in tensor cores and stuff like that, how does that apply to Pi going forward?
We've got an interesting philosophy about how we decide what to put into a Raspberry Pi hardware platform. And it's broadly, you can summarize it as we take the cost of the feature and we divide it through by the fraction of people who will find it useful. So a $1 feature that everyone uses, or a 10-cent feature that's used by a tenth of people, get the same priority in our decision making. And this is actually a really, really hard barrier for new features to overcome, right? If you look at a modern Raspberry Pi, the only qualitatively new feature that's in a Raspberry Pi today that wasn't in the 2012 product is wireless, is Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And that's the only thing that gives a $1 to $2 feature, and it's useful to almost everybody. Pretty much everything else. There's no ADC, there's no analog to digital converter on the Raspberry Pi because it'll cost 10 to 20 cents, and we don't think that actually the vast majority of our users need one. And so what that philosophy tends to do is it tends to push lesser used features off onto external hardware, and it's always been good. That's always been good to us as a decision making heuristic. And so if you want to do some machine learning on a Raspberry Pi, actually for 1.8 gigahertz A72s is quite a lot of machine learning throughput. So a lot of people's machine learning requirements will actually fit onto the CPUs. If you want to do more machine learning than that, you can go and buy a Coral, say a Google Coral accelerator. They're about $60. They've got about 2 TOPS of inference on there. And that applies to that applies to everything from analog to digital converters all the way up to machine learning accelerators. It's been good to us because it's actually created space for other people in our ecosystem to innovate. The fact that we don't try and slurp all of the functionality into the platform means that there is a business. You could start a business selling really nice digital to analog converters that you connect to a Raspberry Pi, and we won't come and drive over you. We won't come and add those features into our platform.
It's interesting. Sometimes what's not on there leads to as much kind of learning opportunity as what is, right? Like the original Model B that I bought, as you say, it doesn't have a DAC on it. And first of all, I was like, why does the music coming out of this thing sound like this? But second of all, it was like, oh, so that's what PWM audio is, right? It's like I had no idea that existed as a concept until I had to work around it because of what was not on that board and had to go buy a little, $5 USB DAC or whatever.
And of course, that was a wonderful learning experience for us because we always kind of knew that you can do better than PWM audio. Well, even if the hardware you have is effectively a filtered pin, you can do a lot better than just piping PCM audio into the duty cycle register for a PWM block. You can do all sorts of clever sigma delta noise shaping stuff, 1-bit DAC effectively. What if it was a hi-fi would be marketed? If it was a hi-fi in my childhood, at least, would have been marketed as Panasonic would market these things as 1-bit DACs, right? And what we've ended up with, if you go back and you run a modern Raspberry Pi operating system on the Raspberry Pi 1, and we're quite proud of, that's kind of like a core a bit of our ethos that you can run today's operating system on the 2012 hardware and it performs pretty well. Actually, you find the audio quality is pretty good, and that's because it's picked up a lot of noise shaping, a lot of fairly alarming noise shaping code over the years.
So since you mentioned old pies, I feel like one of the ways you can tell you're a nonprofit and not a corporation is that you're still supporting decade-old products. So I'm curious. I mean, there's a bunch of questions there. I mean, the big one for me is, until pretty recently, you were offering one 32-bit operating system that ran across the entire product line. And I'm sure, like, philosophically, that was, it's easier to support one platform, et cetera, et cetera. And then, you finally started offering a 64-bit option for newer models. I mean, has that increased the support burden kind of exponentially, or is it something you've taken in stride to now be having kind of different Raspberry Pi OSs?
It was a real wrench for us having two. And we limited ourselves to two. So, I mean, there's another obvious choice, which would be three. So you could have an ARM v6HF Raspbian, effectively, image that ran on Raspberry Pi 1 and Raspberry Pi 0. You could have a ARM v7HF, ARM HF in Debian speak, that runs on Raspberry Pi 2. And then you could have the ARM 64 version that runs on Raspberry Pi 3 and later. So we decided not to do that. So there's no special Raspberry Pi 2 Cortex-A7 build. Yeah, it was a bit of a wrench. I think because of the way that the Debian world works, actually not too much of a wrench. An enormous amount of effort goes into, if you sort of pick what couldn't we have done Raspberry Pi without, obviously, Debian and the way that Debian thinks about the world. And so the fact that a lot of effort goes into making the system fairly architecture neutral allows us to support two fairly radically different architectures, of course, ARM32 and ARM64, with relatively little engineering effort.
Have you had any coordination with any other kind of operating system groups that are non-Linux? I mean, like, for example, like FreeBSD has been trying to bring ARM up to tier 1 support recently. Like, I tried to install FreeBSD on a Pi 2 like 3 years ago, and it was a rough experience. Like, do you have any contact with other groups that are making efforts like that?
Oh, we have sporadic contacts. So I think you can sort of divide operating system support for Raspberry Pi into let's say 4 buckets. So you've got Linux, various Linux distros. You have Windows. And of course, there are sporadic efforts from Microsoft and from the community to make various incarnations of Windows work on Raspberry Pi. Some pretty successful, some fairly ropey. You have so that was 2. You have the BSDs, and we do have some light touch interaction with the various BSD ecosystems. Generally trying to answer questions, and also trying to provide, where we can, software that interfaces with the various subsystems on the device, which isn't GPL licensed, because of course they have a challenge that there are various subsystems where they can't really take bits of Linux kernel. You're close to the Linux kernel drivers being the reference, the software reference architecture, but of course they're inappropriately licensed, and so we occasionally do work to try to help people with that problem. And then you have other operating systems, and that's everything from various research operating systems to RISC OS. Of course, we've always liked the fact that you can run the original ARM operating system on Raspberry Pi, and we do have a very friendly relationship with RISC OS Open, who are just up the road from us.
So to change the topic a little bit, the last couple of years have been challenging for a lot of folks with pandemic supply stuff. And I'm curious, I mean, I think we all follow Raspberry Pi Locator here. So it seems like things are getting a little bit better, but I'm curious how you're feeling about where you're at and what the future holds, and if there's stuff you would do differently, or if this was just an unavoidable side effect of a worldwide pandemic.
I think if I had my time again, I would. What wouldn't I give today for $1 million? For an extra $1 million. Well, of any of the Raspberry Pi chips, actually, I mean, certainly 2711, which is what we used to build Pi 4s. But what wouldn't I give for another $1 million of any of those chips? And of course, it should have been obvious, right? What was the core? The core dynamic was, a pandemic happened. Everyone assumed there would be a massive recession, so stopped ordering. Businesses assumed there would be a massive recession, so they went into destocking mode. At the same time, everyone was at home needing electronic equipment to continue to participate in society, and also in most Europe and North America, having their income protected by various government schemes, and also unable to spend money on services. So you have the same income, but you can no longer go on holiday or go to a restaurant. So what are you going to do? You're going to buy consumer durables. And so it was that pair of transients, the negative going supply transient and the positive going demand transient, were, if you sat someone down in a business school class and you described the situation to them in those terms, of course they would tell you what was going to happen. But at the time when we were in the thick of it, and of course a lot of us were focusing on not getting COVID, nobody called this one right. The big car companies didn't call this one right. So yeah, if I had my time again, obviously I would. What would I like? Would maybe have liked somebody to talk me through it in business school terms, because then I could have spotted what I needed to do. And so towards the end of 2020, you see things start to come apart. So you see first blowouts in component lead times, so components that you would expect to be able to get on 20-week lead times going out to 52-week lead times. We were pretty quick in getting orders on in that environment, but obviously if lead times instantaneously blow out by, say, 3 months in one day, it's inevitably going to create a 3-month void in your supply chain. There's no way you can get orders on fast enough to fill that 3 months. It's just an instantaneous hole.
And it's not like there's parts. It's not like you have warehouses full of parts in China sitting waiting to go. Stuff comes in and gets stuck on boards, and the boards go out, right?
Yeah, and you have some inventory. I mean, so you have some component inventory, and any given day you have some component inventory, and you have some finished goods inventory, and your downstream channel has some inventory, and industrial customers of that downstream channel have some inbound inventory, which is your finished product, right? So there's lots of inventory sloshing around in the system, but no, it's certainly not the case that you have millions of units of every component that you need for your to build a Raspberry Pi. So you have this blowout. Then once you get back into a situation where your orders that you've placed that were now 52-week lead time arrive, you end up in an allocation situation. So you end up in a situation where even though you have orders on, you don't get supplied at 1-to-1 ratio, because there is more. The total aggregate demand exceeds the total aggregate production capacity, and so the only thing you can really do is to give everyone a haircut. So that was the kind of inbound situation for us, which has persisted really up to the present. Up to the present moment. It's a situation which is now improving quite rapidly. And I think what we said when we gave an update in December was, broadly, the first calendar quarter of this year is pretty tough. It has some bright spots, and I think if you go on our Pi Locator, you'll see what some of those bright spots are. Right now, it's things like Raspberry Pi 3A Plus. Later in this quarter, we'll see Raspberry Pi Zero. We'll see a significant improvement in Raspberry Pi Zero availability, which is, of course, kind of cool, because it's still my favorite Raspberry Pi product, the Zero and Zero Wireless. So we'll see some improvement over the course of this quarter, but it's still a constrained quarter. Next quarter is, broadly speaking, a pre-pandemic quarter. So you can see next quarter as being 1.5 to 2 million units of inbound inventory across the various components that we use. But because you have backlogs, you need to do better than that. So that's enough to keep up, but it's not enough to start to get back. So I think what you'll see in the second quarter, much better availability, but a continuation of things like single unit limits for consumers, and what we call active management for our industrial customers, where a customer orders something, and rather than just taking their order, we go back to them and we actively say to them, do you really need that many units? It's got anti-sales. We have salespeople here doing anti-sales. So can I have 10,000 Raspberry Pis? Well, would 1,000 Raspberry Pis each month for 10 months be enough? Because you're trying to detect inventory building, what we call kind of toilet roll hoarding in the context of the pandemic, because that will destroy that. Even if you have a sufficient supply, that kind of beggar your neighbour behaviour, which is totally understandable and totally defensible, and I would absolutely be doing it if I was buying these units. You have to find ways to help people. It's not about stopping people doing it. It's about making your industrial customers comfortable that if they don't do it, they'll be fine. That we'll look after them, that they can disclose their true demand to us, and that we will use that in a good way to help make sure that they don't go lines down, rather than in a bad way to kind of give them a haircut. So you'll see that those behaviors will persist through Q2, but it will be a good environment, but it will be a heavily managed environment. And then from Q3 onwards this year, we effectively have an unlimited supply of pretty much everything we need to make Raspberry Pis. That will allow us to catch up on our backlogs and then get back into the situation we want to be in, which is where we don't actually need to touch our customers so much. We can just put units in channel. The dream with Raspberry Pi, and where we were for out of 11 years, for 9 out of 11 years in the market, we've been in a situation where there are hundreds of thousands to millions of units of Raspberry Pi in channel. And if you wake up one morning as an industrial, as a hobbyist, and you want 10, you can have them. If you wake up as an industrial customer and you want 100,000, you can have them. And that kind of law of large numbers averaging effect means that actually not many people wake up on a given day and want 100,000 units, and therefore you can pull from the channel, and it's as if there's an infinite supply of Raspberry Pis.
Yeah. You just said that the Pi Zero is your favorite. I'm curious why. You can think of Raspberry Pi as having explored another use of Moore's Law. So the sort of classic PC industry use of Moore's Law is to pick a price point, and then every, let's say, 18 months, 2 years, fill that price point up with twice as much compute. And so you get an exponentially increasing amount of compute at a given price. The other thing you can do with Moore's Law is you can pick an amount of compute and you can ride an exponentially decreasing price curve. And you can sort of see Raspberry Pi as a piece of hardware, having said in 2010, 2011, 2012, hey, what would a 2000 era PC cost now actually because of Moore's Law? Oh, it's $35. And that was kind of great. And then we launched Raspberry Pi 2 in 2015. And what did we do? We picked $35 and we filled it with an exponentially increasing amount of compute. We'd actually just gone back to doing at a different price point. We'd gone back to doing what everybody else does with Moore's Law. And really, Raspberry Pi Zero, I love it because it's an example of us of a few months later realizing that we'd conformed, and then asking ourselves, well, what if we didn't conform? What if we said, let's take the 2000? What does a 2000 era PC cost? Oh, it costs $5 or $10. And so I like it for that. And the projects you get with it they're very kind of embedded. You know, it shows up in some of my favorite hobbyist projects, like the high altitude ballooning, because it's very light. It shows up in some of those projects. So I do love it, and we've sold a lot of them. I mean, it's been I don't know what the total numbers are, but it's probably 3 or 4 million. Out of the 50 million, roughly 50 million Raspberry Pis we've sold, probably 3 or 4 million of them have been these tiny little computers. It lives in kind of a fun spot between like a microcontroller and a full-blown PC, right?
Yeah, and of course we've explored with Pico, which came out a couple of years ago, which has our own silicon on it. It's the first product that has Raspberry Pi designed silicon on it. We kind of then have explored what does the world below zero look like. You know, we have this $4 Pico product and $6 Pico W product, just sort of trying to understand, you know, how low can we take, and then the SoC, which you can also buy the microcontroller from us, and it's a 50-cent microcontroller. So, you know, how low can we take that general purpose computing mission?
One of the many things that's always fascinated me about your efforts is how long old models remain in production. I mean, you know, the Pi 1 and 2, you've committed through 2026 to keep making them. I'm curious, like when the supply constraints really kicked in, I mean, everybody wants to buy the latest and greatest, of course, but like there's plenty of hobbyist projects that run just fine on a 3 or a 2, or, you know, my old Model B is still sitting here doing something useful. Did those old models being still in the channel, did that take on kind of a renewed importance when nobody could get 4s and CM4s anymore? Like, did those have an uptick?
It certainly helped that we had access to 2 process nodes. So we had core silicon across 2 process nodes, 40 nanometers for Pi 3 and earlier, and 28 nanometers. So you kind of, being exposed to more process nodes is good. If I had my way, I would have been exposed to 3 or 4 process nodes, but 2 was certainly better than 1. Yeah, we saw people migrating in both directions. So we saw people driven by month-to-month availability behavior. So we saw people who were using Pi 4 era hardware looking to see whether applications could be optimized to run on earlier hardware. We saw people who were using Compute Module 3 migrate. We have a sort of what's currently a pseudo product called CM4S, Compute Module 4S, which is the brains of Compute Module 4 in the Compute Module 3 form factor. And that was developed before the pandemic as a way to give people a migration path up to the modern silicon platform without having to retool their baseboards. But it actually ended up doing duty as a way for, in the periods when we had better 28 nanometer availability and the 40 nanometer availability, it did duty as a way for people to get continuity of supply. It's a product that it is a real and official Raspberry Pi product, but it has never really been launched. It's on our website, but it's never really been launched. It's only been used as a sort of a tactical aid to some of our industrial customers. Yeah, it's interesting. And even today, as I say, you're going to see us come back into availability in kind of broadly the order in which our products were launched. So you're going to see the older, the sort of 3A Plus come in, you see 0W come in, and then probably Pi 4 will be towards the end of the consumer, unrestricted volume consumer availability. Raspberry Pi 4 will probably be towards the end of the transition.
Are you all in on ARM for the foreseeable future? Do you have any thoughts on RISC-V, for example, which is making a lot of headlines as an open source instruction set in the kind of the same embedded space?
It's very hard for me not to be all in on ARM, right? As somebody who spent his childhood drooling over Acorn Archimedes, and as a former colleague of Sophie Wilson, of course, he was responsible for the design of that instruction set architecture. It's very hard for me not to be all in on ARM. I think RISC-V is an interesting development. It's important not to understate the challenges that a new instruction set architecture face in terms of adoption. There's an enormous amount of accumulated invested engineering effort in the ARM architecture and the Linux kernel and the various user lands that run on top of it. Optimizations. Go look in the FFmpeg source code. A huge number of neon optimizations for both 32 and 64-bit ARM. Actually, that accumulated base of engineering investment pales in comparison to the even more enormous level investment in the Intel architecture. If you go into some of these places, you find fast paths for everything from MMX to SSE to SSE2 onwards, right? A whole museum of Intel multimedia instructions. So, and that's stuff that needs to be replicated in the RISC-V space. It's not to say it won't be replicated there, but it does need to be replicated, and that would be a necessary precursor to us being able to do any sort of RISC-V based Raspberry Pi product. So I'm very satisfied with the ARM architecture the ARM ecosystem is quite a good place to hang out, and it's notable that quite a lot of other computer companies have chosen to go hang out there recently. And just as let's say the Linux kernel provides a venue for cooperative, collaborative innovation, so the ARM instruction set and the various cores that you can license that execute that instruction set, they provide. It's a similar sort of it's a similar environment, and certainly a similar source of scale advantage. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with RISC-V. I think in the microcontroller space, those advantages are much less pronounced. And I think where you do see penetration, and I think you'll continue to see penetration of the RISC-V instruction set architecture, is in microcontrollers. And deep embedded.
I was going to say, one of the things we talk about on the FOSS Pod a lot with smaller projects is funding and the organization of the organization. How the business of making these large open source projects works. And I think the funding is probably pretty obvious, but I bet there's probably stuff that people don't understand. And I'm curious what the organizational structure is like, and what your kind of day-to-day involvement and what your job started as and what it is now.
The funding is interesting. The foundations are Topco's a charity. The thing I run is Raspberry Pi Limited. So I run the engineering subsidiary of the foundation. And so we do the engineering. If you buy a Raspberry Pi computer, it's designed by us, and the software was written, the Raspberry Pi specific bits of software were written by us, and the brand is maintained by us. So we do that bit, and then we make money, and then we give that money. We reinvest some of the money in making new Raspberry Pi stuff, and then we give the surplus money to the foundation that does educational things with it. And we've returned on the order of £35 million, I think, over the years to the foundation to fund its educational work. So that's the kind of structure. Where did the money come from in the first place? A handful of us put money in. I think we put in about 100,000. The founding trustees of the foundation lent the foundation about £100,000 between us, actually for a period of very few months, and then those loans were then repaid. So that's the initial capital. And actually until 2021, that was until the autumn of 2021, that was the only money that had gone into Raspberry Pi. So the whole of Raspberry Pi was bootstrapped off that money, and probably about £30,000 or £40,000 of donations from high net worth individuals in Cambridge who thought it was a good idea. So that's kind of fun. And then we did a $45 million funding round in the autumn of 2021. A couple of absolutely fantastic supporters of ours put in $45 million into the trading business, effectively bought new shares in the trading business, and the trading business then ceases to be still a very much a majority-owned subsidiary of the foundation, but no longer a wholly owned subsidiary. But that's the only external money we've actually brought in. In terms of how my job has evolved, I guess it's evolved from kind of overseeing everything, every aspect of Raspberry Pi early on, through to very much that focus on the commercial and engineering side of it, which is natural for me because I'm a software engineer originally. I'm a chip engineer subsequently, and so kind of having the opportunity really to focus in on that aspect of things has been great. We found ourselves a fantastic chief executive for the foundation, Philip Colligan, who poached from Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts in the UK. He was deputy chief exec at Nesta, and he joined us in 2015. I think he was about for the kind of the early years of Raspberry Pi. Actually, the engineering function was big and the charitable function was small, and so Philip was probably only at that point about the fourth employee of the foundation, and then grew that very, very quickly through both organic growth and acquisition to about 150, or organic growth and merger to about 150 people. So that's the foundation in terms of headcount is now rather bigger than us, and he stayed with us. I mean, he's been with us. He will have been with us 8 years this year, and he's transformed it into. I think he's transformed the foundation into something that we didn't envisage when we started. The existence of the Raspberry Pi computer was supposed to be the contribution, right? When now we have a foundation which, obviously we continue to ensure that Raspberry Pi computers exist, but the foundation does much more. Conventional is not the way conventional sounds disparaging. It's not really the right word, but they do much more regular, charitable, the sorts of things you would imagine an educational charity would do. They train teachers and they run clubs and they create courseware and things like that. And so it's kind of wonderful to have both that original strand of kind of anarchic strand of just making sure general purpose computing is everywhere, and then also to take some of the money you've made from that and then go and do more traditional interventions in the space.
But for the most part, the day-to-day of both the charity and of the charitable foundation and the trading company are funded by obviously sales of hardware, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, which is cool, right? We sold 50 million computers, and we don't make very much money when we sell it. We don't make very much profit when we sell a Raspberry Pi. But if you sell 50 million of them, then you do make a bit of money.
I was going to say, like, the idea, like, it sounds like a lot of money when we talk about it in normal human terms, but the idea that you bootstrapped a company that sold 50 million computers on $100,000 is kind of shocking, right? Like, it's an incredible thing.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, it's a testament to the business model. For the longest time, we were a licensing company. So taking a leaf actually out of Arm's book, we designed the Raspberry Pi, and we licensed that design and the use of the Raspberry Pi brand, and obviously the community behind it, to two partners who then made Raspberry Pis and paid us a royalty. The nice thing about that business is, as you grow a traditional manufacturing business, you kind of, it sucks capital in because you need to fund inventory. You know, you're as that we call the working capital loop expands, you need to fund all of that inventory, component inventory, finished goods inventory, receivables, waiting for your customers to pay. You need money as your business gets bigger, so you suck capital in. Because we were a licensing company, the unit economics were a little bit less good because you're only getting a royalty rather than getting the full margin on the product. But it does mean you don't need to suck money in, and that's why the foundation was able to retain 100% ownership of Raspberry Pi Limited while it grew, and thus we're able to devote the entirety of the spare money, the entirety of the surplus profit. We were able to devote the entirety of that to funding the foundation rather than having to share it between the foundation and people had come in over time to contribute capital to the growth of the organization.
So then that raise in 2021 was to transition off of the licensing?
It was certainly to transition to more of a blended model. We are a much more blended organization now. So certainly last year, really a substantial majority of Raspberry Pi computers were actually made by us, or we commissioned the manufacturing. Nobody makes anything, right? So we paid some people to make it for us. But it was a traditional company with us inside the working capital loop. That's obviously capital intensive. Also, a certain amount of that money has obviously gone to pay for sort of advanced R&D stuff, because of course we continue to try to make cool new Raspberry Pi things, and that's not cheap. cheap.
It's kind of remarkable to me to just sit here listening to you talk about this because, 50 million units in a decade is a number that like any kind of publicly traded corporation would salivate over, right? But yet you're working with like pretty thin profit margins. Like the money mostly is going back into like fairly noble kind of educational outreach and so forth. I mean, I don't really have a question here. It's just kind of, this is almost like a unicorn of an operation to see something at this scale that is not, trying to maximize shareholder value constantly.
It's great, right? It's a wonderful, and most of us who are involved in Raspberry Pi have had some sort of business experience before, a more traditional business experience. So I think for all of us, it's kind of been a wonderful toy, I guess, just this experience that no one's built an organization like this before. And it's interesting to see how far we can take it. I mean, we've sold 50 million computers. We fab our own chips. In fact, again, nobody fabs their own chips. We pay people to fab our chips. We design our own chips.
You design your own chips.
And then TSMC fab them for us.
Just like Apple.
Yeah, just like everybody else. It's kind of interesting to see the breadth of what you can do within this interestingly constrained environment.
Yeah, I think you're probably uniquely positioned to know more about what people are using Pis for than pretty much most anybody we would talk to. And I'm curious if there are any things that you were really excited about. I think you mentioned high altitude ballooning a minute ago.
The ham stuff's great. I love the space stuff in general. So I love our own AstroPi program where we've put Pis on the station for kids to run their code on. A lot of European children in Europe have done that. It's a European Space Agency collaboration. So that's a fun one. I love that actually, although there are 2 AstroPis on the space station, there's a bunch more. There are, on any given day, a huge number more Raspberry Pis on the ISS because they get used as payload controllers because they're very robust. And so often, actually, we have no idea how many Raspberry Pis there are on the ISS, and we only tend to find out about these uses when they get downmasked. So that's kind of fun. What else? I just like all the people who've built businesses around it. Whether they're resellers or people who make DAC accessories or people who've built it into some product that they've dreamt up. Just this idea of enabling entrepreneurship, enabling distributed. I mean, I love business. I think entrepreneurship, capitalism, business, they're wonderfully powerful tools for good change in the world. And it's wonderful to have had an opportunity to kind of unlock that kind of innovation, which was getting hard to do, right? Was able to walk down to an electronics store and get a 6502 out of a bin for about the same price that the biggest company in the world would have paid for a 6502, right? It was a very level playing field in the 1970s and 1980s. And the playing field is not level at all anymore in terms of access to advanced technology. It's very hard. It's not that advanced technology is expensive for some of these companies. It's just unavailable. And so taking really advanced technology and making it available at a very flat price, the thing that characterizes Raspberry Pi is not just the thin margins, but the very flat pricing structure. So people come to us and say, so Raspberry Pi is $35. How much will 1,000, how much will I have to pay for 1,000 Raspberry Pis? And the answer is $35,000. You'll eke out 1,000. It might be $34,000, but it's not $25,000 or $15,000, and that's something that's a commitment we've stayed very true to all the way through. And I think it's obviously important from the educational side because it means that the people who are at the bottom end of the volume curve are kids, so you don't want to be rinsing the kids. But it's also the thing that's powered this kind of community, this ecosystem of innovation around the platform.
Well, and just so people understand, I mean, when you look at what Intel or Apple or Nvidia spend developing a new chip, they're looking at billions of dollars in some case over a really long period of time. And I'm curious what when you're developing a new Pi model, part of it is that you license ARM so you get a lot of stuff with that licensing cost. But I'm curious what you spend developing a new Pi model and what that.
Well, remember most big Raspberry Pi products use merchant silicon. Use effectively merchant silicon. So we don't develop the chips that are in the big Raspberry Pis, right? That's Broadcom. So we're not involved in that. When we do our bit of that work is many millions of dollars now. So Raspberry Pi 4 was, I could go and look it up, but Raspberry Pi 4 was probably a $2 or $3 million program. Raspberry Pi Pico was probably a $7 or $8 million program, because that did have a chip development in it, right? So that has the RP2040 microcontroller wrapped up in it. So it's probably RP2040 is about a $5 million program just on its own. And then you have the board development and the software development on top of that. So it's only getting more expensive. I would imagine, we've kind of taken a pause on new big Raspberry Pis because of we focus on just making the existing Raspberry Pis available. But I would imagine that any subsequent Raspberry Pi would be a more than $10 million effort, even without us, without a chip development in.
I guess what I'm getting at, though, is that the benefit of having the Raspberry Pi as this unit of compute and SoC that you can jam into your projects is that if you want to build a project that needs a general purpose computer, you don't need to do that work and effort. You could just say, okay, we have this thing that has these ins and outs, and jam it into the thing that you want to build, and it's a lot more accessible to the smaller market.
Yeah, we have this idea of reluctant hardware companies. That actually the world was full of reluctant hardware companies when we started, as digital signage companies, thin client companies, people building widgets to go into factories to log data. All these people who were really software companies. They all wanted to be software companies. What their differentiating value was in whatever software stack it was they provided. But in order to get that software stack, you can't sell people software. It needs something to run on. And the PC was too expensive, and there weren't readily available embedded PCs at a respectable price point, and therefore people were building a little thin client, going to do all the work of going out and sourcing core silicon and memory and bringing up a board, writing a board support and getting an OS port, just so they get to the point where they could then run their application, which was there. And that's just so much wasted effort. And that's really, what I'm proudest of, I think, with Raspberry Pi's contribution there, is that we freed a whole heap of companies. And so I talked about the boat tail. Now actually you go and you'll see a thin client on the desktop, and you look at it and it's got a boat tail on the end because it's actually a Raspberry Pi in a fancy box running somebody's differentiating software application. And that's in terms of kind of contribution to the public good. Not having thousands of talented engineers wasted doing basically undifferentiating grunt hardware design is really it's a good contribution. And I think ranks actually probably alongside, in terms of what those engineers can do now they're freed up, probably ranks alongside the educational impact in terms of good done by Raspberry Pi.
So I had a big last grand question, and you've kind of actually alluded to an answer already, but I wanted to ask, what emotion do you feel when you hear the words Raspberry Pi 5?
Terror. Sadness in that, the sort of progress towards Raspberry Pi 5 has been derailed by all of the challenges, pandemic and post-pandemic, that have confronted us. I mean, obviously one day there will be a Raspberry Pi 5. We've told people it's not this year, and it isn't this year. I think once we get back into a stock, into our traditional super robust stock position with Raspberry Pi 4, we'll be in a position to think about it, but it is some distance away. These, as I say, they're not cheap programs, and the fact they're not cheap implies that they're not quick, because it takes time to spend that much money. But we'll get there. And we're lucky that this happened to us when Raspberry Pi 4 was the flagship platform, not Raspberry Pi 3, because of course Raspberry Pi 4 is enormously more performant and has a lot more headroom in terms of how much more performance we can eke out of it by clever software optimization.
That was kind of my follow-up question. The 4 to me is kind of the first, I shouldn't say real Pi, but like real computer. It's a quad core, like good IPC, like it finally has full speed Ethernet and all that stuff. I mean, in a world with no pandemic, do you think the Pi 4 would have lasted longer than its predecessors, even without all these external factors?
Yes, absolutely. It's the first one that delivered on our dream, really, of no compromises. You can sit down, and lots of kids did. I mean, we had a lot of charitable work getting these out to people in the pandemic. It's the first one that you can sit down in front of and use as a no compromises entry level PC. You're not going to run a big CAD package on it, but you can run a web browser on it. And so it was good that came along. It's good that was available, and obviously Pi 4 and then Pi 400 during the pandemic. And it was, one of the things that sort of certainly sustained me when I was locked in my house was all the pictures of kids getting their Pi 4 and then Pi 400 kits. These kids who, we had so many, it was such a crime. Sending all the kids in the country home to work from home and forgetting that huge numbers. I think it was 700,000 households in the UK had kids but no general purpose computer was just. It didn't create the inequality. It reminded us all the inequality was there. And so to the extent that we were able to get units out to a few tens of thousands, we had some great philanthropic support. We were able to get a few tens of thousands of units out to kids mostly in the UK. Just the looks on their faces when they opened the box and it was a computer inside was amazing.
I think there's no better place to wrap it up than that, Eben. If people want to find out more, what are the best places to find you?
So raspberrypi.com for Raspberry Pi Limited stuff, so engineering and products, raspberrypi.org for the Raspberry Pi Foundation and all of their good educational work.
That'll do it for us this week. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks to Eben for coming by and chatting with us and being extremely generous with his time. I know he's always really busy.
Yes, it was a joy, honestly. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed every interview we've done for this show, but, the Raspberry Pi phenomenon has gotten so big that it was a real honor to get to talk to him and see that, he's still an engineer at heart. I mean, you never take that out of, no matter how busy he is with other, business and foundation stuff. Being able to get into the weeds on a technical level with him about the stuff that we talked about was just super gratifying. Well,
it was interesting to see that he still seemed a little surprised that it's become this kind of juggernaut, right? Which is fun. I often tell people that my favorite part about this show is talking to people in different stages of the open source software lifecycle. And in this case, this is a hardware project that is barely 10 years old at this point, a little bit more than 10 years old, and is contributing greatly to a massive number of sectors around the world, far beyond what I think they ever anticipated. So you can find out more about Raspberry Pi at raspberrypi.org for the foundation or raspberrypi.com for the board. And that's pi like the number 3.14, not
PI.
The thing that you put in your mouth.
Yes, PI, not PIE.
The other thing I will say is the thing we talked about where Raspberry Pi 3s are now becoming more available. We are starting to see that happen in the real world again. So that's if you want to get a Pi, you don't necessarily... 4s are great. Mm-hmm. If you can't get a 4 at the real price, a 3 is fine for most of the projects that we've talked about on this show and on the Tech Pod in the past.
Yeah, 3 is no slouch. Even if you got an old 1 or 2 lying around, those have their uses as well.
Yeah. So this week's episode, as always, is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the power of open source to Google and all the power of Google to open source. You can find out more about them at opensource.google. Thanks, Google. As always, this week's episode was produced by Matt Purdy and edited by Sabrina Hill. Thanks, Matt and Sabrina. And we will be back in a couple weeks with another episode. I think we're going to talk about KiCad on the next one.
Mm-hmm. We are.
See y'all then.